encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula, considering what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. All right, so our agenda, we've covered the first 3 items. We're going to take a look at a quick update about the steering committee and new resources. Well, they've met. That's the update. Jamie provided that in the email. Our discussion will be the majority of our meeting and feedback on the proposals, and then we'll cover our next meeting details. All right, so we are in meeting 5. We're reviewing public comment on the draft framework and then making final recommendations on components. The materials we're using are the public comments, requested materials, and the steering committee feedback. Next meeting will be meeting 6, where we will make final policy considerations. For example, how to define student groups and recommendations on policies, recommendations on reporting structures, and the materials we'll be using will be public comments and the resources that we request from meeting 5. Okay. So, Jamie, we are going to start with looking at our supports and services prioritization. I think that's 2 meetings in a row. I've butchered that word.
It's all right. So I am going to do a little interesting kind of screen sharing. So sorry, I hopped around on the slide deck there just a moment, but so kind of charge 1, as Morgan just said, is to look at our comments that were turned in, our recommendations that were turned in, excuse me, last meeting, meeting number 4. And we're going to look at it alongside the draft formula. And so you're kind of charged with looking to see, is there a correlation? Do you feel as if it's a clear representation? The majority of the things that were included in your final recommendations are actually included in the draft. If so, if not, that kind of stuff. Then what we'll do is I'll take down number 4, and then I'll pop up number 5, which then just gives us a blank section for the 4 components: base, weights, those 4 pieces. And then we will see if there are any other additions you want to make or clarifications. So basically it is looking at your recommendations up against the draft. Yay, nay, let's do this, that, or the other. And then if there is time today, we will actually get into some of the policy considerations that we are charged to do in meeting number 6. There will likely be time to do that today. So forgive me and thank you for your grace on the front end as I kind of share and do a couple different screens at one time. But I think I can do it. So
you can. You can. And we are the most accepting group of people you could possibly be trying new things out on a computer meeting with.
You are right. And the first one is my 4 for the week. So what a thrill. What an absolute thrill. Okie doke. So sharing screen. All right, Cami, you're who I see. Give me a thumbs up if you see it. Yay. On the left-hand side is meeting number 4. These were the recommendations, and this is the draft formula that was released last week. You've seen it already attached in your email from last week from me. And we'll go down to base, and you can see base, then we'll do weights, direct funding and outcomes like this. So have it in your Google Drive folder, but you also have it here on your screen. So we'll just kind of open up the floor to start talking about, do you feel as if there is a representation here? And if not, I'm going to jot it down and we'll add it into our meeting 5 document. This is where we are. Let me scroll up a little bit.
The first thing I noticed is that we are very specific, which I still think I was really glad we took the time to really hammer that out last meeting. They've included RTI support. That's something we don't have specified even under our other must-haves. They've also included technology.
The one thing that I maybe isn't really in there, and maybe it's just somewhere that's kind of hidden, but is the reducing class sizes or fixing the ratios maybe. I mean, we really talked about that in very specific detail, like you just said, and I didn't really see that anywhere on here, like at all, as far as that discussion. So, you know, I don't know if that's maybe hidden somewhere, that maybe I'm just not looking deep enough into it, or that's just one thing that I noticed.
No, I definitely think that's something we should add as something that's a recommendation. And with our specific ratios, because we took the time to hammer that out, we know what's important to us. We know what works. And there's,
I think, piggybacking off the ratios, the salaries as well. It talks about a lot of the stuff we talked about very generally, like the school-based supports and stuff, and educator salaries. But one of the things I heard a lot from school staff is that like our classified staff are getting paid less than almost any other similar profession, like cafeteria isn't being paid as much as food service workers in other areas. And so I don't know if there's a way we can specify that yes, we want educator salaries to increase, but also we want salaries to increase for all school employees.
So let me ask you a quick question. So when we get down here to policy, when we pull up the recommendation list, here, I'll go ahead and do it. For, this is meeting number 5 document. One of the things is here is teacher salaries. We have 2 little sections. So do you feel comfortable putting it in here in the policy considerations where we kind of get in the weeds more than up in the base section?
Yeah, I mean, whatever way it's going to get, I mean, noticed and factored in as our recommendation. Like,
so if educator salaries are part of the base, but it's within policy that we actually hammer out the specifics.
Okay, we can do that.
So it might belong here.
Could we add like educator and staff salaries? I just, sure. that was one of the biggest things I heard from people who got back to me, was that it wasn't just teacher salaries, it was across the board in education, there being a lack of funding for employees.
All right. Got it.
The class size, I'm just going to say, I knew I read it somewhere in our draft framework, and so it is brought up under additional considerations supported by the subcommittees, but it doesn't look like they've placed it anywhere. So I think that that would be something to be really valuable to add to that base.
So currently I have reducing class sizes or a decrease in those ratios and educator and staff salaries. Okay.
Good. All right.
Okay, so just a question. Morgan, you mentioned RTI being on the right and it wasn't on the left. And so where did it come from? I'm just making sure I'm understanding.
Yeah, so this is the draft framework that has kind of come from the consolidation of all the subcommittee recommendations.
That's what I thought. Okay, so we're talking about adding things. Is this discussion to remove anything? Or, okay, all right, just clarifying. Okay. I was like, are we supposed to? Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
No, but it is our chance to say, hey, there's something that's really important to us and we don't want this to get missed.
Yeah, okay.
The other thing that we had recommended as a must-have was the universal pre-K, and that also is in the same spot in the draft funding for an additional consideration as the class size ratio. So I think that might be another one worth adding to our base.
Okay. I'll just give me the heads up when you're ready to move on to weights.
Okay. Does anyone see anything else that's missing from the base in the draft formula that was important to us? Or are we ready to move on to weights? We can always come back. All right, let's do some weights. Okay. So we had spent a good chunk of time talking about our concerns for the unique learning needs, and the way that was worded. We did get clarification about how that was funded. Just looking at the differences.
And just a note, when we get over here to direct cert and Title I, that's also in the policy considerations. So we will talk more about that.
Okay.
Get down to the policy part.
Okay.
I have a question. When we're talking about poverty and concentrated poverty and rural, are we looking at those as collective or separate? Because a district can be rural and be poverty and concentrated poverty.
So those do have in the policy considerations, we'll see that ED and rural, sparsity, all of that has its own separate definition. Even separate from title. Well, ED is separate from title. Here, I'll pull it up for you. So see here, we have ED, concentration of poverty, sparsity. So we don't have rule on this, this document, but if you want to talk about the definition of rule, we can when we get there as well. But that's a good question.
I noticed that charter schools, I just want to make sure I'm correct, that ended up in there as a separate weight. We discussed in our committee possibly having it be like, if you're in poverty, you get the money, whether or not you're at a charter school. But this is saying that that's going to be a separate weight. Is that correct? Okay. Is there anything that we can add to specify, like, one of the things that I talked with people about this week after looking at this was the, there's a $20,000 pay difference, WBIR just did a story on it, between counties that are right next to each other. Do we feel like that is adequately covered within these weights? Or is there a way to help make sure that there's, I think that standard, Daniel, I think was the one who brought up like having a standard salary for all educators and then going from there. But is there a way we can make sure that there's wording in there to see if there's, because then the allocation of resources becomes completely different when counties right next to each other have very different salaries, and where the best teachers are going to end up wanting to go a lot of the time. Is there wording? I don't know the best way to do that. That's why I'm kind of saying it like this is. They're
Currently,
for-
this is my interpretation, but I'm not so sure I really see any clear language where there is a salary connection to some of the definitions we see here, which is rural, sparsity. So as far as funding goes, but not as far as salaries go. So I think it would probably behoove the group, if that is something that you feel strongly about, that becomes a part of your recommendation list for this week, or your feedback.
Because most of these weights would be generated on like the individual student level, right? Like some would be district, but most of them would be like a specific student qualifying for one of those weights and bringing in some educational dollars. And a district may choose to spend that money to hire additional staff, whether it be educational assistants, special education teachers, classroom teachers to address those needs, language teachers. But I don't know that this would necessarily be the impact for teacher salaries. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's where I was going to.
Okay. So I think I definitely think we specify that in the policy area. If we can get to that this meeting, we will, or next meeting, we'll highlight that.
So I'm going to go ahead and write it down.
Okay. I think the majority of our conversation in these weights was focused more on the unique learning needs, because we were concerned that a student wouldn't be able to qualify, because it was kind of lumping together a whole variety of learnings, or students could hit kind of those two specific, like they could hit two or more. And we wanted to make sure that that was still addressed.
They are multipliers, so
Yeah.
that's clarification.
Yeah.
For sure.
So when I look, I see like most of what, knowing that most of our concern, I feel like, is addressed there. The only thing is we didn't want to ignore trauma as a unique learning need. And we also specified the use of WEDA data to support weighting for students who are English language learners. We had a concern about the charter schools receiving additional dollars beyond what is the typical state funding. You know, we were concerned about that being a weight, but again, we're not striking from recommendations here in the draft formula we're adding.
Well, and that also reads like, if like my county, Knox County, if Knox County has a charter school that's in the district that is utilizing a school facility owned by the district, then it's going to need to have some extra funding for that. And I understand that now. And I did not know, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. So I get that. I would expect Knox County to get a little bit of extra if it's got a charter school that we're having to house and do things with. And so I think, and if I'm wrong, correct me now, because this is the place. if that's not what it means.
So currently, charters have to pay rent to districts, which is not necessarily the same in other states. So they have to pay rent for districts. So essentially, what ends up happening is, you know, this money can cover that rent cost. And so, of course, leaving some extra money to support those students whose families have chosen to send them to charter.
Okay, so is there any specific that you would like to add for the weights? Or can we just add trauma to unique learning needs bucket and use WEDA data to support the weighting of the ELL students? Are those two things that we could add?
And I'm just kind of thinking out loud on the unique learning needs, where it's talking about if students have qualified Section 504 dyslexia plans. I'm just wondering if that would cover all students who might need supports in that area, if they might be able to, I don't know, would families be able to access the resources in order to have that would in turn provide them with the support to receive that in a classroom or in a school system? I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I don't know if I'm asking the same question as you, but when I read that, I had a question as well about that because like dyslexia, that right now goes under other health impairment, is my understanding. And that's something like a family has to seek that diagnosis out themselves. It's not something that our testing within the district, at least for our district, brings forward. So that was something that I had more questions about. I wasn't entirely sure like how to ask. So Hannah, I think you did a better job putting that into words.
Yeah, that's my question. And I'm sure that's something that happens differently in lots of different places. So, one answer might not work everywhere. But I was just kind of thinking through what that might look like for one student versus another student. So I don't know, just thinking through that.
Yeah. So I guess, is it possible, Jamie, for us to get some clarifying language about how those students, like when we're talking about students with disabilities, like what are we talking about? Gifted, I think, I feel like we have a good handle on that. The English language learners, I feel like we have a good handle on that, and we would like the WIDA data. And then the qualified section 504 dyslexia plans. We're just curious, like, is there an additional plan for this to be something that is supported within the districts in terms of dyslexia, or is this something that, again, families would have to bring this information to us for their student to get those additional dollars for that weight?
Well, and I'm thinking about the way funding is allocated as well with unique learning needs as far as like a 504 plan. And I could be reading it incorrectly, but like I'm thinking about like students with ADHD, which they might not require the same like interventionist, but do require materials like alternative seating or other like places where they can take a break or ways to move around within the classroom. So making sure that we clarify, because a lot of times in the language in the school setting, students with disabilities is students with like a learning disability. And are we making sure that is that the only thing that, is it either a physical or like a diagnosed like reading disability that is it? Or are we also going to allocate money for kids with a 504 for like an OHI? I've also had students with things like, they've been on chemotherapy after cancer or something and have had diverse needs for movement or seating. And so making sure that we supply all of that and that teachers aren't having to pay for that out of their own pocket, which is a lot of times the current situation.
Yeah. That OHI is like a really big umbrella that helps us get services to a lot of different students with a lot of different needs. So we just want to make sure that that still exists within this language, that it's still, and from what I heard in the steering committee meeting, yes, but we'd like to make sure. If I remember correctly. I feel like I watched a lot of recorded meetings this weekend.
I know one thing they said in that steering committee meeting that I remember, I'm kind of like you. I don't remember everything that was said, but one thing that they did say was about the EL students. They were talking about how they needed to figure out a way to, because the needs of maybe brand new kids are a whole lot more than maybe the kids that are getting ready to test out. And so, but they didn't mention WIDA. And so maybe we just bring that up and say, that's a good assessment tool that we look at as teachers. I mean, we look at it to know what our students can and can't do or what we should be doing or not. And so, I mean, that was, one of the things that while I was watching that, I thought, that's where that WIDA could come in, maybe. I don't know. Thought.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And that's used statewide. So that's, that's like the outcomes, right?
So I'm curious to know if the use of WIDA falls more in the policy as well, policy considerations.
Good question. Let me look and see if I can find a spot where it goes.
And the reason I'm curious, and of course, group, you all dig in here, because if we're thinking about our unique learning needs are identified up here in our weights, but then is it in policy that we would actually request the use of WIDA to support, Does that make sense?
I can see that. I don't see a specific place yet within the policy that would be added. There's a K to 2 weight section, but we can add, like, we can add to that policy list, right? Okay.
There are empties at the bottom.
Let's add that to an empty.
Just tell me when you're ready for me to move on.
Let's do some direct funding. So one of our big topics of conversation that definitely came up in the steering committee as well as in the chair meeting was the competitive funding, or even like some creative staffing for the CTE, considering like part-time work so someone can still work in their industry and also teach. So that conversation is happening across a lot of subcommittees. So that is definitely, so this says that all CTE funding would be provided in one area as direct funding for participating students. This would include funding for staffing, materials, and emphasize those courses and pathways that are high demand and high value. And this currently impacts 141,843 students. That's a lot of kids. Is there anything more specific? Because we had specified we wanted to mitigate the issues with recruiting those instructors across the state. We wanted some uniformity. And we also wanted to make sure that we were considering the cost of running those programs, like the equipment that's needed and the materials that's needed to maintain them. So not just get it started, but keep it rolling for 5 to 10 years. One of the other points that was made that was interesting too was that making sure that what the students are learning is current or, at the forefront of these industries, so that when these students are leaving with their industry certifications, that they were well equipped to start in the workplace. And I thought that was another excellent point. So those conversations are happening. Do you feel like that our concerns and those points are reflected in what you see here in the direct funding for CTE?
I think that definitely making sure that the most up-to-date equipment is being used and that you're getting good quality instructors to do that. And I think they in that steering committee meeting, I heard them talk about that quite a bit. And they did mention, even though, it's they mentioned materials and things like that, but they mentioned specifically up-to-date equipment and things, because things are changing all the time, and I don't know all of the things about all of the CTE pathways, but I know in healthcare, things change all the time. So, and I would imagine that it's the same way with, electricians and welders and all of those other areas that they're working in. So, I think that I don't think we're the only ones that are discussing CTE. So I think it's good. And I think, still emphasizing that the teachers that are doing, I think that goes without saying or goes along with the whole educator salaries in general. Just making it competitive so that you're going to get quality instructors in their areas that want to come and teach kids.
Okay.
I would like excuse me, I would like some clarification though. When I read this the way it's written, increased salaries for CTE teachers, are we speaking about making them equitable to all teachers or above and beyond? Because some teachers have gone back and gotten several degrees. If a teacher who has 3 or 4 degrees or a doctorate who has put in 20 years, are we talking about someone coming in from the business thing making as much or more than they have? Are we talking equity? What are we talking about there?
We were looking to attract quality candidates. So really we were looking to be competitive with the industry as well. So it wasn't necessarily that they're being paid less than, your classroom teachers, but that we want to make sure we're attracting people from these industries that want to be there, but also aren't going to be taking a huge pay cut. Ideally we want a highly qualified electrician teaching these CTE classes. When they could, if they could be making $125,000 running their own business versus working in education, I could see why they would choose to run their own business. So what we were looking for was a way to be competitive, to attract high quality candidates within those industries.
And so currently in the draft, it says this will include funding for staffing. So of course, within the policy is where it would shake out to be more specific.
So we can hammer that down a little bit more closely if we want. That's kind of a tricky one. Like, I don't know. And that might be necessarily like at the district level, they decide how to staff. If they need an electrician teacher, they decide how to allocate salary for that so that they have someone who's teaching, so that students are left with a high quality program and they're leaving with the right skills, ready to work, as opposed to, 5 years, 10 years behind the instruction, if that makes sense.
And it's flexible funding.
Yeah.
There, you're thinking about it being flexible for districts.
Okay, so 2 other areas that are in the draft for direct funding are fast growing, so significant enrollment growth within a school community, because they would need same year support, not necessarily being able to use last year's data as a way to fund what they need in this current school year. Does anyone see anything that we should add to that area for fast growth? All right, and additional is tutoring. So funding to provide high dosage, low ratio tutoring via TNL course for rising 4th grade students who scored at below on the 3rd grade TCAP. As outlined in the learning loss and student acceleration statute, students would have individualized learning plans and data submissions as required. Anything you would add to that? I thought that was an interesting addition. All right, let's look at some outcomes.
Hold on. I do.
All right, I'm holding
Just
Tammy.
ask about the tutoring portion.
Yeah.
Is this related to or as a result of feels like a billion years ago, last summer we're going to make tutoring camps and do all these things for learning loss? That act, if that was an act or if it was that piece of legislation where we're going to, starting this summer, start having camps and those types. Is that related to that? Is that the Tennessee All-Corps?
The 2 different things. So tutoring is supporting students with on grade level materials. So they're tier 1 instruction. So really supporting students to kind of close that gap. It is different than intervention. We already have
Okay.
that kind of stuff in place. So tutoring is what we think. Here is a student who's falling behind in X. How do we bring them up to speed in X using the materials from X? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it says in parentheses, as outlined in the learning loss and student acceleration statute. And that's the part that I called it a bunch of funny names, and that's the name I was looking for right there in front of my face. But so that's like that particular thing is talking about bringing in college students and after school program putting adults in those rooms with those kids for the after-school programs or the summer programs or things that they might offer, a school district might offer. Is that correct?
So some are before and after school, but some are actually doing it within the school day. So districts are all approaching it the way that they can with,
Okay.
staffing restraints and, that kind of stuff. So tutoring does support that, that third grade retention part of that statute. Summer programming is something on its own. And so that is also just another way to support
Yeah.
students who are not meeting
I was trying to
loss.
I was trying to separate that out with the ESSER that we got for that particular thing. And so as long as it's not the same, I don't want to be dipping out of the wrong bucket. Okay, that's good.
We have a lot of buckets.
Okay, let's talk outcomes. So when we looked at outcomes, really our primary focus was the question whether we thought that there should be considerations only for students to help close that achievement gap, or if the funding considerations should be open to all students. And our consensus was open to all, with a heavier weight on marginalized students or communities, recognizing that those are areas that may require some additional funding dollars to help close that achievement gap. But we still wanted all students to benefit from reaching these outcomes, So one area that we could probably touch on and maybe add to is the literacy. They're still requesting feedback for public comment, especially for the K-2 outcomes. The universal screener is not an option as one of the outcome options. And so I spoke to a couple of colleagues and they suggested we don't really have anything like statewide that is a consistent measure. So what we would suggest is a range of things that are being used within the state, like STAR test, DIBELS, Easy CBM, giving options for districts, because there's benchmarks built into a lot of these already that I think it would be fairly easy to pull into and use as potential outcome measures for K-2 literacy. Any comments or suggestions? All right. Anything else within the, sorry, go ahead.
What's the thought on not using the universal screener on that?
I think it was just how they designed it to be used. That's not, they don't want it to see, they don't want to see it become simply an outcome measure where the push is to get students to meet a certain, they want it to be an information gathering to inform teaching, is my understanding, not necessarily an outcome, if that makes sense.
So think of it as an authentic screener, rather than pushing for an achievement level to receive additional dollars.
So would that mean that we're looking to give teachers credit for the growth that they have from their students across a year, or simply just achievement?
So growth has been a conversation for lots of subcommittees. So feel free to start that conversation at this point if you'd like to.
I would love to do that. I think growth with literacy. I'm just thinking about all of, if we're marking off all the weighting for the budget, all of those things come into their literacy scores. And so like, for example, I'm considered a qualified teacher and like my achievement scores don't necessarily match someone that is in a county next to mine, but my growth scores are typically really high. I think we talked about that a little bit. I think even at the high school level, that happens as well, where making sure that we give credit for students who grow a lot as well. And I don't necessarily see that. As I'm looking at this, I'm wanting to reiterate the importance of more school counselors in the building, because I think a lot of these outcomes are going to be positively impacted by a school counselor being able to help kids get to these places. But with the literacy, I just think if we're looking for growth measures, I think it's going to be hard. I agree that I think different districts and counties are going to want to do it different ways. I think it's going to be hard to kind of, I hate using the word standardize, but standardize how we measure that. But I definitely think outcomes wise from an elementary literacy perspective, we need to give teachers some type of credit for the growth they make in their students across a year, not just achievement. I think that as well. Reading on grade level is a great thing, but it's also an arbitrary kind of thing that's been, it depends on where you start, because I have students that read on grade level who read on grade level the summer before, and I have students who read on grade level who moved 4 levels this year. And I think that the students who moved 4 levels this year, I should get some kind of outcome funding for the work that we put into moving those students.
Yeah. All right. Any other comments for literacy or any of the other outcomes? Oh, I see something we forgot to come back to in direct funding. One thing we had talked about was funding for the fine arts and foreign language programs in K-12. And there wasn't anything in there in terms of direct funding for that.
And so at this juncture, we can add it. Is that what we're saying?
I think so. I'm looking to see if there's anything in policy that we can add. There isn't anything already there that we can add, but we can definitely add that. But that it's not, that there isn't really anything that they specify, CCTE, and that they don't, and we haven't specified anywhere fine arts funding or foreign language programs. I feel like that would go really well in direct funding. Could we add that, Jamie?
Yep, I have it down.
All right. Okay. Any other concerns or additions for what we have in terms of the draft funding and what our concerns? Is there anything, whoop, there goes my notebook. Is there anything that's missing that we definitely want to make sure our recommendations are reflected, or do we want to start working in policy and start hammering down some specifics with our remaining time?
So Morgan, just real quick before we move to policy, I've highlighted on the draft, there are some additional considerations that are definitely reflected in the conversation we are having today. So as you can see, the very first one talks about a reduction in class size, talks about high dosage tutoring, talks about paraprofessionals. Then we look at universal pre-K 4. We have that up in our base. We have career coaches, which we didn't talk about today. However, that has been one that has kind of gotten lumped in with counselors. And then overall salaries outside of educators, which I think was something we talked about in just a moment ago, is that educator and staff salaries.
So I think my question is, though, these things are all being supported by the subcommittees, but we don't see them reflected all in the the base, the weights, the outcomes, or the direct funding. So this is why we talked about like hammering those things down in the policy pieces, right? To make sure that they're still a part of the recommendation.
Sure. And then I also think adding it to the recommendation list today could just continue to emphasize the additional considerations in the draft. So they're there.
I think we do that because there are 3 topics that we spent the majority of our time on, right? Like looking at the ratios. We talked a significant amount of time about pre-K, and we were all in agreement about the benefits that would ripple through the community for years with starting pre-K at a younger age and with more families being able to access it. And the overall salaries outside of educators. We haven't talked about that a ton, but we all know the implications, and we're seeing it in action right now. Like, we're having such a hard time finding substitutes. We know how hard it is to maintain paraprofessionals and educational assistants. because there's a variety of jobs that they can go and do right now with this for the same pay or for a higher pay. So I think that all three of those things we should probably like to specify back up in our base again, I guess, Jamie. Does that make sense, everyone?
So I have my little list here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and close out meeting number 4 recommendations. And I'm going to pull up meeting 5. And as I type, just tell me whether or not this is where you're going. Okay. Anything else in the base? Okay.
Okay. Anything missing?
I don't know if we
Alright.
need to be this specific in language, but on weight, add trauma to unique learning needs. Could we specify that we want trauma-informed trainings in public schools as well? That was one of the things. So yes, trauma, but also training, not just giving money, but also it's specifically being designated for staff training.
Yes, and one of the policy areas we'll look at too is professional development and training, and I think that could be great to specify there as well.
Yep.
Good point.
And the state does currently fund trauma-informed trainings through our whole child consultants. Doesn't necessarily hit every district, but it is funding that is available at this point. So it may even be seeing if we can just extend that. Okay, so I'll roll on down to policy.
Okay. All right. So I highlighted a couple. So that definition of economically disadvantaged. So the current definition is direct certification. Jamie, is there a little bit more of that? Just because we were like those umbrellas for us were important to us. So we just wanted to make sure that we all understand exactly how we're getting those weights for our students.
Sure. Let me reshare so I can pull up some other information. All right. By the way, just let you know this section down here for policy, the first 3 around definitions. The other ones basically ask a question for the team to consider answers to. So everything below it. So the first 3 are definitions.
Okay.
Okie doke. So the current definition or criteria for direct cert, we think of that as like TANF funds, students who receive TANF or SNAP, homeless, runaway, migrant, foster, Head Start. Those are all funds that we consider fall under ED. So those are resources that students would have to receive based on their families actually applying for those. It is not title. So title is school designation. So these are in addition to.
Jamie, do you know if undocumented families receive those services? Like, is that, are they allowed to, I guess is the word.
You know, I don't know the answer to that question. That's a good one.
They could fall, some could fall under the category of migrant,
Mm-hmm.
but not necessarily all others.
What's tricky about that one is it requires families disclosing that information, which, Sharon, I think you're highlighting a population that's going to be very hesitant to lay claim to that, right?
And I don't know that we're legally allowed to ask, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. I just remember having that conversation, but that conversation happened a few years ago. So
I'm just thinking if our definition of poverty is based on direct services, and then you have families who are not receiving direct services, but very well may be, you know, impoverished. And so that's why I asked.
So just a quick clarification that there is a difference between economically disadvantaged and concentration of poverty. So correct me if I'm wrong, when you're talking about particularly those undocumented families, you are talking about direct cert or ED. Is that the question you were asking? Do they actually fall under your direct cert?
Well,
You're not going into the next definition of concentration of poverty?
well, it could be both.
And we would have students that would fall in both 100%.
Just trying to think about where to put it in the which box.
I was just, I mean, I don't know. Do undocumented families receive services? I mean, they can, right? I don't know. I don't know how that works.
Yeah, that's
Like
a question
the-
to have on my little question
The
list.
ones that you named out, I don't know.
Put it on our question list, please, Jamie, because that's a good one.
I have it on the question list.
All right. Okay, any questions about the definition of sparsity, or can we move on to teacher salaries because we've got a question to answer there?
We
All
have two questions around teacher salaries.
All right, so the first question is, what, if any, requirements should the formula require on investing new education dollars into existing educator salaries moving forward? And the second question is, are there any other policies for teacher salaries that should be included? So we had some very specific language last meeting about this. So that first question, to me, that means like what extra money did we want to put in the teachers that are already teaching? Is that how we're all interpreting that question, or is that just me? Okay. So what requirements do we have? Like, to me, this looks to me like our, oh, I lost my word. This, retention. That was the word I was looking for. This is a great question for teacher retention. So we had talked about raising 20% pay increase to the base salary with a minimum of 50K. And we had talked about increased in planning time. So focusing on the educator salaries, would this be a good place to put the 20% pay increase to base salary with a minimum of 50K?
I also think a kind of stipulation about the money allocated from the state needs to be given to teachers. Because it's, we've gotten these so-called raises, and then the money does not trickle down to the teachers. It goes to the districts and it disappears. And you get like a $750 stipend or something. So closing the loopholes, whatever they're going to.
Yeah, that's almost closing the loopholes or a request for transparency for when these happen, like explaining like exactly what that would look like at the teacher level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so like the language of like not making this discretionary spending for districts, this needs to be teacher salary increases.
Okay.
And I think there's conversation around growth and accountability and things like that. But I think when we're looking at this, I would kind of focus away from performance. I think that, looking more at just funding as a whole.
I agree.
Yes, because I think the answer is retention. Like, what should we require of teachers to be able to get that is not the question. The answer is retention. We want to keep them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just raising quality of life for a whole lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
I think piggybacking off of that, retention bonuses would be something I would add here as well. I don't know that we've specifically used that language, but that we make sure that we're fiscally incentivizing teachers to continue teaching. And then I think additional incentivization for continuing education. In past meetings, we've talked a little bit about like a master's degree, and that's one way to have continued education. One of my people reached out and said like the bachelor's salary barely covered their cost of living, but also all of our trainings and things like that. If teachers are involved in continuing betterment and learning how to teach diverse populations and meet the needs of a variety of students, I feel like we need to be incentivizing that like in this budget as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm typing as you all talk, so you tell me if I need to shift anything as I'm typing.
No.
There's retention bonuses and then making it a cultural shift that is permanent. So retention bonus sounds a lot like that $750 stipend for staying, and making it normalizing $50,000 base salaries in Tennessee sounds like a different thing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. So they're both bulleted here. So,
Or is it both? Is it $50,000 and a $750 bonus for actually staying another? I just want to make sure that we get it, that we understand, and that, yeah.
currently it reads as both because there isn't the word or.
Okay.
But if you want to stick it in there, and we can add an and up here, and fiscally incentivizing teachers.
Yeah.
I don't know, somebody else.
That sounds fine.
Yep.
I agree.
I also think that as education has become such a difficult field to be in, that so many teachers have explained that to children who are in classrooms, especially at the secondary level, and you're seeing like a massive drop off in people trying to become teachers. So the happier you make teachers, you solve your recruitment problem. Everyone sees miserable teachers and they don't want to be that person. So I just think it's an investment in both retention and recruitment.
And also, Daniel, this is a question for you because I can't remember which conversation this was, but there was an issue with different counties doing different things with how many papers you have, and maybe not getting credit for that master's and not getting credit for that doctorate because you happen to be teaching in one county and the scores were low at a place, so you don't get credit for that. Was that a conversation? Like, if that's happening, that
Yeah.
ought to be standardized across the board. And I don't know if that's a place where this is, or if that's something from another box, but.
So I think it would probably go under this question right here. Are there any other policies? Because this one here is really talking about investing new dollars into existing educator salaries. So that's an additional policy consideration.
The language, Cami, in Shelby County was an alternative salary schedule. I believe that's what Martha Moore told me back at one of our TAC meetings.
Yeah.
And we've since transitioned back to a more traditional salary schedule as of this year. So I get paid for my master's for the first time this year, or I get paid for one of my master's degrees this year. There's not a second lane, but so you could say limiting districts from doing merit-based alternative salary schedules because there's no connection between. Anyway, you should be paid for your education.
Well, and also we were talking about incentivizing teachers for continuing things. That's what Elizabeth was saying. And if that's not continuing things, I don't know what is. So, yeah.
I wonder if this is a place to look at, I don't know, supporting struggling schools or schools who really need strong educators, if that is a place where, I don't know, if teachers could receive more compensation for being in a school that needs this or, has this need. And I know we've kind of talked about that as far as like CTE and things like that, but maybe some incentive to be in a school that is struggling, that needs that support to kind of gain that traction. I'm just kind of thinking through that too.
No, I could see that. I mean, I'm going to use a phrase that's not at all what I really mean, but like, kind of akin to danger pay. Like, these are challenging places to teach. It's harder to maintain your job at those places because the burnout rate is high. So, yeah, I could see that. Suggestions for
So
board.
my question is, how do you determine who's at need and who's not? Because there will be probably folks that maybe they aren't struggling, but they'll figure out a way to say that they're struggling so they get more funding. Does that make sense? So like, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here. Like, is there some sort of benchmark that you have to meet to qualify for, for that?
Yeah, and I don't really know that is something that's quantifiable, but I'm just thinking, as educators, and we're looking at accountability and things like that, there are some places where it might just be easier in some ways, and some places that it might just be more challenging for an array of reasons. So I'm just thinking, how do you keep strong educators in places like that where they're working really hard and they're putting all their resources into it? I don't know. Maybe this is not the spot. I'm just kind of thinking.
Well, don't schools or the state, I mean, the state notes which schools are struggling in terms of academics and low performance. That might be one metric that you could look at, because that's usually what happens in those types of schools.
Mm-hmm. Akin to Title I funding and things like that.
Well, I think yes, but I think even when scores are released or report cards are released, I mean, the state shows which are reward schools and, which need more help. I mean, I'm just saying that is one possible metric, not the only metric, but a possible metric. Because the school report card would also show attendance and graduation rate, dropout rate. And I'm sure there's a way to identify discipline and other ways that can be marked for that. So I would agree with Hannah.
Okay. I mean, this is something too, we can call it right here this weekend. This is something or this weekend. We haven't even started the week yet, really. We can call it today and revisit this next week. At this point, this is where we could pick up. So this could be a good spot to put some more thought into this week, because I think that this is a really interesting point. I think that this is something we've definitely explored both parts of this kind of conundrum, and I think it definitely deserves more conversation. And we are very close. We're over our time. So out of respect for that's what I'm going to put forth as a plan. How do you feel about that as a committee?
Yeah, that sounds great. And maybe it's not even teacher salary. Maybe it's something that needs to be thought at in a different way. I mean, maybe it's not that you should be compensated through pay, or maybe it's not even compensation. I don't know. It's just, I do think it's an important conversation. But
And when you're talking about, like earlier when we were talking about rates for areas, rural, urban, like various different types of weights and situations where they might need extra support, and maybe is extra teaching or staffing or raises for those people supposed to be in that box from before. I hope that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So would you all vote to leave it here? I just added it here. It does have nice little ellipses at the end, but leave it here, take it off for this week. Think about it some more for next week.
Yeah. So I think let's pick up here next week on the 25th.
Okay, leave it, take it off. Which one?
I think leave it so that we have our starting point, because a lot can happen in a week, and
Okay.
knowing how my memory works anyways, I would be better off having a sentence starter.
So I'm going to ask you all to just take just a moment. Again, Morgan, as you know, I'll be sending this to you just for your approval, but visually, verbally, this moment, take a look at the base, the weight, direct funding and outcomes. That will go to the commissioner this evening.
If you're going to send it that like right after this, but you might want to change that to arts, AARTS.
Thank you.
Yeah. I didn't want to be that teacher. I didn't want to be that teacher. I'm not that teacher, but I was like, oh, look at the commissioner. Well, she hit send right now.
Oh, I'm a English teacher. Get you.
Oh,
I love it.
That would be my fault if that went in as a fine hours.
I'm wondering too, like, and maybe this is something that we can just kind of think through for maybe the next one, but like when we're saying add trauma to unique learning needs, I wonder if we need to be more specific in how we define that, so that when they're looking at that, they're thinking, okay, we can quantify that. This is something that could actually be. I mean, I realize there are lots of various forms, but maybe even looking at like ACEs of, the qualifying things. Because just saying adding trauma, I wonder if that might be too broad to really.
Like a student descriptor that's more specific than just trauma.
Yes.
Yep.
And the last thing it says under outcomes, include growth for literacy. I think just growth in general when assessing teacher performance is very important for every category.
So this is for outcomes. Those outcome measures tended to be more heavier on the achievement side. So if this was include growth in the outcomes section, so would you like me to add growth up in? Is there a different section? Just for clarification, is there a different section, or do you just want me to take off the words for literacy?
I would leave it exactly as it is right now. I'm just kidding. Just taking off literacy, so it includes all categories of teachers.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just growth in addition to achievement is what I think we were getting at.
Yes. That's a good catch. We needed that on a nice cold afternoon for public review. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and let you know. Here we go again. I'm going to reshare for our next meeting. And here we go.
All right, so we are back at it for our 6th and final meeting, January 25th, 3:30 Central Time, 4:30 Eastern Time. We'll be on Teams, and we will pick up with that discussion about incentivizing or how we fund those challenging teaching environments to maintain those high-quality teachers in those challenging environments, how we maintain and retain. Any questions, comments, or anything else before we go?
The 3 questions I captured is curious if there is an additional plan for districts to identify or will families have to apply for, such as SWD, dyslexia, ADHD, Second question, does OHI still exist in this formula? Question number 3, direct cert, do undocumented families receive this as well? Do we have any other questions or need to clarify any of those? Wordsmith them.
No, those sound good.
Okay.
All right. As always, you guys make my job so easy. You're the best. One more week, guys. We can do it. All right. Stay safe in all the crazy weather that we have coming or not coming. We'll see. And be well, everyone.
You too.
Take care.
Yeah.
Go build a snowman.
Thank you. See you later.
All right. You'll email me?
I am